unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
But I'd like to make this talk a little bit different because I feel like I'm talking to family and within almost family. We could make this talk very scientific if we would like and have lots of data, lots of confusing information about different enzymatic reactions that go along with all kinds of reproductive technology within the ovary and beyond. I don't really think that would say what we're trying to say this morning. So this is going to be more of a, I hope, a talk that we can enjoy and have some discussion together afterwards. When I was trying to think of what ideal reproduction is all about, a drill for you to do if you haven't already done it is to write that down for yourself. What is ideal reproduction? What did God intend for us? I wrote down this paragraph, so I'll read it with you, and then it leads to where we're going in this. And I have a feeling at the end of this talk this morning there will be some of you who disclaim me completely and want to send me back on the quickest plane to wherever. We'll worry about that at the end of it. Ideal of reproduction. This is my drill. You do your own. You should come up with different words here and there. A male and a female, both adults, enter into a marriage covenant with a lifelong commitment to love one another. From this relationship grows a love that results in a glorious spiritual, mental, and physical union that is not unlike the creative, dynamic love that God has for us. From this loving sexual union comes a genetically, physically, and mentally new life, joining this divinely created world in which we all share as those produced in the image and likeness of our Creator. And at the end of that, we're supposed to shout, yes. In this ideal utopian reproductive situation, there are no miscarriages or abortions. There are no massive hemorrhages and maternal deaths, no sepsis following delivery, no large vesicovaginal fistulas to repair afterwards, no ectopic pregnancies or PID or endometriosis, no IUDs, Depo-Provera, or birth control pills, no infertility, and no new reproductive technologies. The realities of our world simply do not give us those luxuries. And so we began as Christian people to think, how can we deal with our world where we live and still allow God to direct, guide, and totally care for our lives in a way that doesn't lead us to be any more guilt-ridden than we already are as people who sin all the time, and which sins stack up worse than the others. Sometimes it's hard to know. I'd like to make this a little bit personal so you understand where I'm coming from at the final comments in this, because to me this whole discussion of new reproductive technologies within marriage especially, but outside of marriage also, is going to boil down to some very simple questions that you've probably already been asking extensively. And those questions are simple and easy to ask. They're not always simple and easy to answer. I started out in college at Baylor University from 68 to 72. Those years are important because those are the years when the Southern Baptist Convention, you know, Baylor University was part of that for quite some time, was actually one of the country's strongest lobbies for Roe v. Wade with the Southern Baptist Christian Life Commission. Many of you have forgotten those days, and would probably like to do so, but that was the case. I remember sitting in my Christian ethics class at Baylor University and hearing why a pro-choice stance was the only reasonable option for a reasonably thinking, intelligent human being in the United States in 1970. And I made an A in the class because I reiterated what the professor had said, and I walked out with my A. It troubled me greatly. I wasn't sure if the A was worth it. At the time, I was a ministerial student. I did not make it into the ministry. I'm a ministerial student flunk out, not because I didn't have the grades to make it. My religion classes were the things that brought up my chemistry grades. However, I flunked out because it was too hard. It was too difficult. I wasn't that nice a person, never could be. Wasn't able to live with the intangibles of being a minister. It's a hard thing to do. People are supposed to change when you speak to them. They're supposed to show response. They're not supposed to go to sleep on the back row. They're supposed to act interested when you're talking to them, especially about the Scripture. They're supposed to be invigorated, excited, and come out of there a changed life. Well, you and I both know that doesn't happen very often. And you could just preach your heart out, and at the end of it, the whole place would snore. And it's just so frustrating, and I just felt like I couldn't handle that. So I went into some field where I could see the change. I could do something, and when it was all over, I could go, that's different. You know, so now I'm a surgeon. It's real simple. You know, but back in those early years, I was beginning to realize that there are going to be problems in the medical profession and with our concept of how we can live within that profession. I certainly was not going to go into any field that concentrated its efforts on topics like abortion, because it had bothered me enough in college, so I didn't want to do that. So I was bound and determined to become a doctor, but to avoid such controversial issues. I wanted to live a more quiet and peaceful life and see change with my hands. So I had that as a plan. After medical school, in which we stayed very active in medical ethics with a fellow named Kenneth Vaux, who many of you know here in the Chicago area, a wonderful human being in many, many ways. And Dr. Vaux led a small group of us for over 3 years in weekly studies in ethics. Usually disturbed us greatly throughout the rest of the week, but that was probably good. I left Baylor College of Medicine in '75, determined two things: never to be a surgeon and never to go into OB-GYN. I was going to be family practice in a small town. Well, I went to Africa for almost the first year out of medical school. My wife and I went with the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board into rural Nigeria and rural Zimbabwe, which was then Rhodesia. It's one of those years in which you get no credit, you have no certificate at the end of it, you have nothing that says you did anything, but your life has changed forever. I wound up doing so much surgery under wonderful guiding hands of some wonderful missionary physicians that I was no longer not even afraid of it, I enjoyed it. What a horrible thing to say. But besides that, we saw the incredible suffering of the developing world in terms of what women go through in reproductive health. Now, I don't think all of you realize, sitting here, where you are in the United States. In West Africa today, 1 in every 12 to 14 women in rural West Africa will die in childbirth. There are as many people, women, dying in pregnancy in childbirth every week in Africa as if 2 747s full of pregnant women were crashing together in midair and everyone dying. If you, in fact, I heard that quoted recently as a daily figure instead of weekly. We have worked for many years now in West Africa. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Between 40 and 70 women die per 1,000 deliveries in rural West Africa, in the remote areas, the remote towns. In the major cities and major universities and the big hospitals in West Africa, between 10 and 14 women die for every 1,000 deliveries. You can compare that to 1 in every 10,000 deliveries in the United States, and you begin to understand the significant difference. You begin to see how far technology in America has brought you and I as a society. All of you who are women here need to understand that to take a total stance against technology today and say that that's God's will is neither reasonable nor compassionate in a worldview. So understand that initially. When I left Africa after that year, we came back into the military to pay back my medical school scholarship. We did not come from wealth, neither Carolyn nor I, and appreciate greatly the military for having paid us through medical school. But I changed from family practice into OB-GYN because we were determined to go back into West Africa full-time for the rest of our lives and stay there and work, especially in obstetrics and gynecology, because those are the worst problems we had faced in rural Africa. The general surgery problems, you know, I don't want to be critical of any general surgeons who are out here, but it's all surface stuff, you know. We're in the depth of the pelvis trying to get out of all kinds of challenging situations, and it was exciting, it was thrilling, and occasionally someone lived. And it was a wonderful feeling when that happened. And so this was why I changed into OB-GYN, was to go back to Africa, not to stay here, and not to deal with all the issues that we would have to face as life has come along. So I forgot the things I had said to myself in the college years and went into OB-GYN, switched from family practice into obstetrics and gynecology, not to stay here in this country, but to go back somewhere else. But we have stayed, and it has been a remarkable, challenging situation. As I left the OB-GYN residency program, we still longed to go as medical missionaries. In our last year of residency, we had a child with Down syndrome. Now, that is a wonderful event, in all honesty, but it takes several years to realize that. It's not an immediate wonderful event when it occurs as a surprise. It's a shock, it's a life change, it's something that suddenly alters all of your career plans. Africa was no longer open to us. We could not go with the child we had been given. We thought, my goodness, what are we going to do here in this world, arguing about the issues of this country for which we were not called to do? And it was an amazing time for us. I went back to the seminary, seeking God's will in what He would have us do in life. And from 1980 to 84, wound up taking all kinds of night classes and weekends, and finally finished about 60 hours at Harding Graduate School of Religion, one of those Church of Christ institutions that's far too, you know, conservative for any Southern Baptist to really wink at, and found a wonderful experience there. I found out that the Bible is the Bible, and that extensive study of the Bible in a spiritual way leads you closer and closer to someone called Christ, and also exposes more and more your inadequacies, weaknesses, and sinful experiences, and that's part of it. And we began to understand that God may have roles for us here. We chose to go into academic medicine. I always say we because these are family decisions always. They're never individual. We went into academic medicine for 3 reasons: to enhance families within the OB-GYN structure of education, teaching, and practice, to help those underserved in our societies with the emphasis on the mental retardation patients and the poor, and finally to help those back in West Africa and developing countries, to stay involved, to learn what we could do to help and to make a difference. I thought that would be enough. I thought that would keep us busy. And then in 83 to 85, I wound up being on some pediatric committees because we had a child with Down syndrome, and I was already on the National Down Syndrome Congress Board of Directors at that time, and was on the ACOG Ethics Committee, and so I wound up on a pediatric committee. I think that was Reed Bell's fault, to be honest. We were in this committee meeting, and I began to see how God can use even non-thinking surgical types on occasion. We were in these large committee meetings that had been called to set up something called infant bioethics committees for the nurseries. And I would sit there as the youngest person with the least knowledge on these large committee meetings, looking around the room at esteemed people who talk ethics, speak ethics, write books about ethics, go on TV about ethics, and I was sitting down at the end of the room going, you know, why am I here? After about the fourth meeting with all of these esteemed people in the room, I had become more and more frustrated with the fact that our society is able to count the cost of handicapped newborns, but is never able to count the benefits of a handicapped newborn. And finally, in frustration one day, I just blurted out, this entire meeting is forgetting one word, and that's the concept of grace. And the fact that a handicapped newborn brings that concept into our lives more than anything else in the world. We begin to see the smallest of things that they accomplish as being the greatest of joys. We begin to see the tremendous weaknesses we all have and the fragileness of what we call normalcy. We begin to understand the concepts of unconditional love, unmerited favor, because that's what they give back to us. And we begin to quit thinking in competitive ways, because this child is not going to compete. This child is not going to demand to be loved better when she hits a home run. In fact, we just get the biggest kick out of watching Jenny in sports, because regardless of the score, at the end of the game, you ask Jenny, Jenny, how'd you do? Me won. That's her concept and her comment, and she did. And we begin to see that in our own lives, and our own lives take a totally different turn that America needs so badly. And you could see the hush come across that committee. And what had been a different tone completely now turned to be one of compassion and caring for a handicapped newborn. And I went home and I told Carolyn, I said, you know, sometimes the Lord picks even the dumbest of us to make the best comments. And we began to understand that God had placed us there and that we had something to say and that it was meaningful. We had been used in ways that we had never intended. Being in a country we had never intended to stay in. Things began to change in other ways as well, and stances began to come along. Reed Bell was on the American Academy of Pediatrics committee as the ACOG committee met with them for 2 or 3 years back in the mid-'80s talking about maternal-fetal conflict. What a terrible issue. We fought it at the ACOG level for about 3 years, finally came out with a statement of which I claim only one word. I learned how to lose on committees. It said in that statement, almost never can a woman's total autonomy be overruled even at term gestation in favor of the fetus. My word was almost. And that was all I got out of 3 years of hassle, and I began to understand that some of these battles can be tough. On those committee meetings with pediatrics, I oftentimes wound up wishing I was sitting with the pediatricians and wondered if that had some meaning for me as a struggling surgeon, but found myself with the American College of OB-GYN as well. The next few years were interesting as well, and God kept putting us into situations where He called upon comments to be made that we had really not intended, but oftentimes came. I was placed on the National Advisory Board for Ethics in Reproduction. It was interesting. Felt very much like a token conservative in a room that didn't want to take that position. After about 3 years, we finally came out with an article as a committee that was going to be the first unanimous opinion in favor of cloning by a national ethics board in the world. And there was great pounding of chests. The problem with that was I had never agreed to that, and I was part of the committee. So they sent the rough draft of the article to me, and I was supposed to sign off on this right before it went into print in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal. And I called him and I said, you can't do this. You honestly can't do this. This says it's a unanimous opinion. You know mine was never in agreement, ever. I've put it in writing. I've called you repeatedly. You know that. And the stunned voice at the end of the telephone said, that's correct. And I said, well, then you and I have a problem. This article can't go. I know it's in its last revision and it's supposed to come out in about a month or two, but it can't go. And so I found out occasionally you have to draw a line in the sand. You can't just keep walking forward. You can't just keep being swept onward with the tide. I resigned from that committee after that. I have no regrets. I would resign again. The resignation sent kind of a shockwave through the American College of OB-GYN and through that committee. They replaced me with several tokens, not just one. And I think the committee became more balanced because I took a stance and said, you can't do this. They gave me 6 lines to write at the end of the article. I've forgotten what those lines were, but I have a feeling more people read my 6 lines than the 45-page article. So I felt like that was probably significant enough. But I began to learn that occasionally you do have to draw a line in the sand. You have to stand there, and you may have to walk off. There have been times when it's been difficult to take stances on many of these issues because we as Christian people don't always agree. And we can't expect each other to always be in agreement on each of these issues. To demand that as a sign of our Christian faith is neither biblical nor reasonable. It's neither kind nor loving nor even sensible. And so there will be times when we decide where to stand as an individual on a social issue that has very little to do with our concept of carrying our cross with Christ and standing with Him in a loving world that sometimes is not very nice. So these are the kind of things we face when you start asking questions that you're asking in this meeting. And I'd like to mention 2 or 3 things now that are actually substantive toward the topic and end with that and then have some discussion, because to me the issues here really are quite narrow. We could talk a long time about legal aspects of the embryo. I think you've already heard quite a bit of that. We could talk a long time about inheritance rights and everything else. We could talk a long time about prostaglandin effects on ovulatory function and all of these sorts of concepts. But it boils down to really 2 or 3 things. So let me mention those to you. One is we're talking about a process of reproduction. God gave us a reproductive process. He gave us an imperfect process to deal with from a perfect God. Between 25 and 65%, according to the different studies you look at, of every pregnancy winds up in a miscarriage in this natural process. That's a high number. It's not a small number. It means that all of those conceptuses are being formed, concepti, conceptions, but they are passing through the system. They are not implanting, or if they are implanting, they're being lost in pregnancy, usually very early. Therefore, we have an imperfect process in which we're dealing. We're not dealing with something that we can mandate brief alterations in and all of a sudden create a process that will have no loss of an embryo. That is not within our power. It's not within our might. It's not what God also gave us in the way of a reproductive process. Secondly, we have a natural process of reproduction that for women, if we ever make the decision in this country to back away completely from them, as has occurred in areas like West Africa, the harshness, the cruelty, the injustice of that stance is something no woman in the modern world would ever tolerate again. All you would have to do is take the plane flight with me, then the 16-hour road trip north from where you land into that area where there are no doctors, into what our hospital is called by one of our missionary docs from Johns Hopkins, 100 miles past the call of the Lord. And when you take that last 4-hour, 100-mile road trip, you will find what I'm talking about and you will begin to understand. It is not only an imperfect process, it can be a cruel and a harsh one. And the people who suffer the most are the women of our world. And we're not talking about minimal suffering. We're not talking about something that we can all go home afterwards and be thankful for our epidural anesthesia. We're talking about massive suffering and dying and terrible debilitation when they survive in many, many, many of the cases. So this is what the reality of reproduction is. And then the third thing is you would find what infertility means in our world. In America, we look upon people who are infertile as a sad situation, as a tragic situation, but one in which we have so many blessings in life we can all get by, and many times we feel like it's a minimal tragedy compared to so many others that we should walk through and not worry about. We can adopt. We can open our homes and our lives to multiple children in many ways. We should not be so concerned about this tragedy, for whatever the reasons are, that we proceed to any kind of technology that in any way would ever infringe upon the rights of even a single embryo. Believe me, that thought is there in many, many, many people. You go into West Africa where infertility is not a social concern, it's a life and death concern. In rural Ghana and Nigeria, where I have worked in so many of the different tribes, to be infertile is essentially the end of your life as a woman as you know it. In some of the most remote villages, it is not unheard of to poison these women simply because there are too many mouths to feed as there are. They are not of use in the society. It is not unheard of to make them field hands for the rest of their life, to almost enslave them to a life of labor since they are not of use in society. And you begin to understand worldwide what infertility means, and you begin to sense the tragedy of infertility that women feel, even in our country. And your compassion has to grow for them. It can't become less. So many times I wish I could take all of you and put you onto a plane and I could drop you into that area of the world and I could drive you that 16-hour drive and I could leave you for a few months. And then I could say, now come back. Now come back to the United States and let's talk. Let's talk about your adamant positions, about your adamant stances, about those positions that do not allow women who are suffering and dying and crying in our world to have a chance to have anything different. Many times I feel that way, although I know it'll never happen. So where do I come down as a gynecologist with these three big concerns looking at me, yet still being a biblical person in my thought, in my life, and praying and asking God where to go in these different things? I think the Bible is pretty blatantly pro-life, pro-life, very much. The pro-choice position in the Bible is just not there. You can look throughout the Scripture and try to find it said somewhere where it is our right to go and stop the life of an embryo or a fetus because of our sense of rights and our sense of self-worth and self-autonomy. It's not there, at least not in the readings I've done. I can't find it. The pro-life position is spelled out strongly over and over and over in Scripture, that God has ordained this life we have. He has blessed us with it. He has asked us to take care of it. He's asked us to do the very best we can with it. He said that in Jeremiah, He knew us long before. He said in Psalms that He's created us long before we ever showed up. And God is there from the beginning, and I do not doubt that, question it, nor even ever think it shouldn't be proposed as that way. But is it totally adamant in Scripture? And I am not so sure. If you take the position, as many people have, that all of created life begins completely and adamantly with the embryo, and that nothing else could ever be done with that embryo that might in any way jeopardize it or endanger it, then you're taking a position that almost doesn't allow care for women. And I want you to understand that. If you take this position, you're saying essentially that many things could not occur. No reproductive technologies are allowable, marriage or not marriage, doesn't matter. If there's a chance that an embryo could be lost, and that is going to be your line in the sand that you've drawn, then you can't really enter into reproductive technologies. In vitro fertilization, any of them. I mean, there is a chance in the freezing process somewhere, or a chance in the process somewhere, that an embryo will be lost. That is a chance you take to enter into these. And as a family, if that's a chance you don't want to take, then you can't enter there. The problem we have today is informed consent, and many people aren't always told of these chances. And we're an intelligent country, and we should be told. But if you come to the conclusion that the embryo must be protected at all costs, and that that's where you're going to stand as a Christian person, and that's where God is asking you to stand, then besides no reproductive technologies, there really can be almost no contraception of any kind as well. No oral contraceptive, certainly of anything less than a 32 microgram pill, because occasionally there will be an ovulation. Occasionally there could be a pregnancy occur, and the ectopic pregnancy rate will be slightly higher. Things like IUDs with a higher ectopic pregnancy rate are simply out of the question. But it goes farther than that. You really could never do a tubal ligation, a sterilization, because ultimately we get ectopic pregnancies following those. And we have intervened in a way that causes an embryo to occur but not be allowed to go to term gestation. Ultimately, you could never even perform a hysterectomy. I want you to think about it. 1 in every 20,000 to 1 in every 100,000 after hysterectomies result in an abdominal pregnancy, because a fallopian tube was left behind, because an ovary was left behind, and because there's a fistula tract in the vaginal cuff. And so we get a pregnancy. So there is that not only theoretical but real chance that you would have done something that caused an embryo to be allowed to be developed but never go to full term. You could certainly never operate on an ectopic pregnancy before absolute death of that growing embryo in the tube had occurred and rupture had finished and the woman was either alive or not. And certainly methotrexate treatment of an ectopic pregnancy would not be allowed. If you really carry it a long ways, most women would have to stop all jogging, most sex, especially orgasmic sex, and even strong laughter in hopes that they never disrupted a pregnancy within the pelvis, not knowing whether or not they were ever pregnant. It'd have to be an awfully cautious lifestyle. So if we're going to take the extreme adamant position that life begins with the embryo and that everything must be totally built around that fact, and that we must stop anything completely that ever results in the loss of a single embryo, then we are creating a very tough life for the women of our world. And we're creating an impossible situation for those of us who try to take care of them. Now, where does that leave us as we face these issues? I feel like that personally, people within a marriage setting especially can, with informed consent and within reason, engage in some new reproductive technologies. And I know we have doctors in this audience who have done that, who have helped people in a marital setting engage in new reproductive technologies. They do it by usually implanting the number of embryos that are made rather than discarding any. With tight control, it is possible usually to stay below 3 to 5 embryos being created even in a in vitro situation. Occasionally, though, inserting as many as are made can wind up in disastrous clinical situations that lead to nothing but near calamity and occasionally near death for the pregnant woman with no surviving embryos. And so this is not always as reasonable as we would like for it to seem, but it can be done. Even in those situations, you will occasionally lose an embryo. So the question of whether or not it should be done based on your concept of total protection of the embryo will be something you have to deal with in terms of in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, really all of them. All of the different processes, gift, zift, it doesn't matter. They'll all be the same in that an occasional embryo could be forfeited in the process. The people who jump in and say it's worth it, read the just war, the justice in war, or the just war ethic of the Old Testament. They read where God occasionally says, to create and reach this endpoint, I will allow this disaster. And they weigh the benefits, the loss, the urgency, the need, the tragedy of a lost embryo with the possibility of a full life, and they move ahead. Have they dropped out of Christianity to do that? I don't think so. They have made a thoughtful decision that I think all of us need to support in terms of their faith and their ability to deal with it. Do we all need to agree with it? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And many times it may be necessary for us as Christian people to take stronger policy stances at times than we would do on an individual patient care basis. And I can see the reason for that as well. So when we're talking about new reproductive technologies in marriage, it's going to boil down to how much you want to deal with an occasional loss of an embryo. You may finally ask, what is the need for marriage in this whole issue? Why are we even worried about it? Why can't anybody in our society, like is happening now all the time, decide to have a child and go ahead and have it? I know at Michigan it was a fascinating thing to watch our infertility division. They refused to do any new reproductive technologies outside of marriage. And there were rumblings of lawsuits all the time. And we all dropped our knees and prayed thankfulness for Wayne State down in Detroit, because they had no limits of any kind on anything, and so we could refer everybody to Wayne State. The courts had already implied to the University of Michigan that if they were the only program in the state, they would be forced by law to conduct new reproductive technologies outside of marriage. And I don't know if we would have held on to our new reproductive technologists when our endocrinologists had that occurred. But we live in a society where people try to force their opinions one way or the other. They try to force us into settings we can't always abide with. And it is inherent to the Christian faith that we stand when we are pushed beyond what our personal limits are. And so when somebody takes a strong stance on behalf of the reproductive process and says, I'm protecting what I believe God has created and has asked me to stand for, I'm not going to get very upset about that. I'm really not. Because they're making that stance, and it's where they believe they should stand. And there are occasions when you have to join that stance and stand there as well. We in America need to learn to stand up for what God has asked us to do. Oftentimes, He places us in settings that are uncomfortable, that are life-threatening, that are incredibly worrisome, and we must land to stand up. We must land on our feet, even when things knock us over, and we need to keep coming back, because that's what Christ has asked us to do. In the marriage setting, it's time for Americans to take a stance. It's that simple. Children need two-parent families, male, female, two-parent families. It's just that simple. I could stand here and give you all kinds of statistics, but it's not provable, and it never will be. It's a simple matter of understanding. Again, personal experiences change your thoughts. The 5 years I spent in New Orleans, where I was chairman of OB-GYN at LSU and then head of their reproductive or reconstructive pelvic surgery program, was a fascinating time for us in the inner city of New Orleans, one of the classic inner cities of America. Fatherless homes, okay? Fatherless homes, that's the rule. Homes in which there are no dads. It's not a good thing. It's not an okay thing. It's not something that we should say we can do now a reproductive technology to give you the right and the joy of having that situation. That's not reasonable behavior. It's not sensible behavior. The fatherless homes lead to so many of the horrible crimes, the inability of young people to see a way into the future, the terrible economic problems of the young women who are seeking to raise children without the support of the males who help the pregnancies occur. To say that we're now going to enter into this type of activity in gleeful bliss and with some sort of understanding that this is what the technology was made for and should be used for, absolutely baffles my mind after spending those years in New Orleans working with the inner city. Our inner cities cry out for those of us in our society to use some common sense and not to use the technological advances that we've been given to openly create situations in which we should be crying out with the inner city, this is a problem. And instead we go, if you've got the money, it's fine. It's not fine. Never has been. So in terms of the question of should this be done outside of marriage, you just heard my answer. I don't think so. Do we need to take stances in America? I absolutely think we must. Are we going to agree, you and I, on every stance that's taken? Oh, I really doubt it. I don't think so at all. Is that going to bother me? No, not at all. You know, I think the Tower of Babel story was put in the Bible for a real strong reason, and I want to close with that. When we throw all of our discussions together and all of the information we have about new reproductive technologies and family structures and family values, and we toss them all into a pile, even though we all speak English, it's almost like 1,000 different languages. I think God puts us in that setting so that we can babble together, so that we can babble and bubble and gurgle and finally cry out as individuals and say, God, you have put me as a person into places where you want me to work, function, and live. Show me how to do that. Show me how to forgive. Show me how to think about marriage and never forget the book of Hosea, where forgiveness, 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 forgiveness is repeated over and over and over. And show me the new reproductive technology ways of life, and remember that you created each one of us special, and help me to be protective as far as I can go and still function in what you've allowed and asked me to do toward every embryo you ever make.